Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Defiance of the Patriots, The Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, by Benjamin L. Carp, narrated by Joe Barrett. Introduction. Teapot in a Tempest. And now I pray you, sir, for still 'tis beating in my mind, your reason for raising this sea storm. Miranda to Prospero, Act 1, Scene 2, Shakespeare, The Tempest. It seems we have troublesome times a-coming, for there is great disturbance abroad in the earth, and they say it is tea that caused it. So then, if they will quarrel about such a trifling thing as that, what must we expect but war? And I think, or at least fear, it will be so. Jemima Condit, October 1st, 1774. On December 16, 1773, at a crowded meeting in the largest church in Boston, the leather dresser, Adam Colson, supposedly shouted, "Boston harbor a teapot this night." Colson then marched down to the water's edge at Griffin's Wharf to make his metaphor come true. If a tempest in a teapot describes a big disturbance about a small matter, Boston, in the midst of a turbulent political crisis over the authority of the British Empire, was in this moment a teapot in a tempest. Colson and his companions staged an act of rebellion that would have worldwide significance. About 100 men boarded the 3 trading ships that were riding at Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor. They hoisted 340 chests onto the decks. These chests contained more than 46 tons of tea. The men smashed open the chests, releasing the leaves' bittersweet aroma into the air. It was the intoxicating smell of exotic luxury, and a couple of men were so unable to resist it that they stuffed some of the leaves into their pockets. The rest of the men remembered that there were principles at stake. They dumped the tea into the salt water below. The ships, which had arrived in the previous weeks from London, were named the Dartmouth, for an aspiring port town, the Eleanor, for a woman, and the Beaver, in homage to New England's industrious work ethic. The tea destroyers hailed from all walks of life, men with strong backs and hard Yankee accents. They were a mix of young merchants, craftsmen, apprentices, and workers. They believed in a wrathful God, and they feared that the temptations of tea would turn them into tools of a corrupt, tyrannical empire. The grown men among them believed they were embarked on a noble deed of patriotic virtue. The younger boys thrilled to the idea of an evening spent wreaking chaos and destruction. The men and boys had names like Thomas Melville, Joshua Wyeth, and, improbably, George Robert Twelves Hughes. On the evening of December 16th, they spoke for all the dissidents in Boston who had squared off against the policies of the British government. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a rebellion or even a protest against the king, but it set in motion a series of events that led to open revolt against the British crown. The destruction of the tea, which became known as the Boston Tea Party 50 years later, was a bold, defiant act of political mobilization. These destroyers had carefully calculated their reasons for dumping the tea on that particular evening. They needed to destroy the tea before the stroke of midnight. If they failed, then the hated customs officers would seize the tea and make it available for sale. The destroyers were trying to stop the tea from being sold at all. They would have preferred to force the captains of the 3 ships to weigh anchor, pilot their way back out of Boston Harbor, and carry the tea back to London. But when the ship's owners proved reluctant to send their ships back, the men decided they had no other choice but to destroy the tea. Why did the destroyers want to prevent the tea from landing in Boston? The easiest answer is that Parliament had imposed a tax on tea. Many people thought this tax was reasonable, but a dissident faction of Bostonians, the majority of the townspeople in fact, believed that Parliament had no right to raise revenue from American colonists without the colonists' consent. The Bostonians worried that more taxes were on the way. They knew that the revenue from the taxes paid the salaries of the civil officials that the British government had appointed to enforce the imposition of taxes. To the Bostonians and other dissidents throughout the colonies, this was a blatant example of tyranny. Even worse, this tea was to be sold by the preferred agents of a monopoly company, the British East India Company. Parliament had imposed this new arrangement under the Tea Act, which now threatened American merchants by cutting them out of the tea trade. If Parliament could sell tea to America this way and earn revenue from the sales, then the British government could start creating new monopolies on the sale of other products. Exorbitant prices, mammoth monopolies, and crushing taxes might leave Americans with nothing. Dissidents were frightened, not just because of what they saw happening in Boston, but because of what they had seen happening throughout the world. Tyranny and liberty were locked in a constant struggle, and the dissident Bostonians knew which side they supported. The story of the Boston Tea Party was not just a local story, but a global story. The British East India Company, which was gaining territorial control over more and more South Asians, made much of its profit selling tea, a product grown by East Asians. When Europeans and Americans drank tea, they mixed it with sugar, farmed by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. When the Bostonians dumped this tea in the harbor to protest the actions of the East India Company and the British Parliament, they dressed as Native Americans. These were just some of the historical currents swirling around the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party had revolutionary significance. It set the stage for an American rebellion and the war that followed. The Tea Party was an expression of political ideology about taxes, rights, and authority. Just as important, it was a window onto American culture and society of the time. Americans' consumer habits, including the colonists' love of tea, played a role in the way the resistance unfolded. Prevailing views of American Indians in colonial society help us to understand the disguises that the destroyers wore. Boston's colonial legacy of riotous parades, angry protest, and political organization provided the ingredients that made the Tea Party possible. These elements offer a fuller picture of why the Tea Party happened. The destruction of the tea was a quintessential rejection of authority that became a cherished American tradition. The Tea Party involved a relatively broad segment of the population, even though this was an era when only the elite were thought fit to rule and make decisions. Because of this, the destruction set a world standard for future democratic protest. From the British perspective, the Boston Tea Party was the culmination of a decade's worth of flawed imperial policy, and the event certainly played a part in its imperial legacy. To Americans, the Tea Party became an emblem of their faith that a determined and organized group can accomplish momentous political change, culminating in independence. The participants were men who showed their willingness to defy the law in defense of their rights. To this day, journalists, pundits, and politicians frequently cite the Tea Party as the first and most famous example of Americans' heritage of civil disobedience, their penchant for secret conspiracies, and their aversion to foreign trade restrictions, excessive taxation, or government overreach. By reading the tea leaves at the bottom of Boston Harbor, we can see the American character itself taking shape. The day after the Tea Party, the attorney and future President John Adams called it the most magnificent movement of all. He went on, "There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire." Not everyone agreed. Some found the story of the Tea Party to be inspiring and democratic, but others called it riotous, disorderly, and disturbing. They saw a pack of rebels who had disobeyed the law, destroyed private property, and threatened anyone who stood in their way. 18th-century Boston was a town where crowd action was not uncommon. From time to time, townspeople pulled down opponents' houses, brawled with soldiers, threw bricks at officials, tarred and feathered civilians, and otherwise asserted their power. In this climate, the tea consignees and senior customs officials had feared for their lives to such a degree that they fled to Castle Island offshore. By December 16, 1773, Bostonians had topped it all off with the invasion and destruction of private property as part of their political protest. The kind of political movement that birthed the Tea Party protest and the Revolution seems both exciting and extreme. Throughout history and today, the Boston Tea Party has given off mixed signals, in part because it involved so little bloodshed, no one died at the Boston Tea Party. It became a formative expression of liberty, independence, and civil disobedience, representing the finest human tradition of nonviolent resistance to tyranny. The Tea Party was sublime, in John Adams's words, because it was a rejection of arbitrary rule. The Tea Party is also stirring in its radical potential for mobilizing people from all walks of life. Most people can't imagine themselves in knee breeches signing the Declaration of Independence, but they can easily imagine destroying the East India Company's tea. At the same time, the Boston Tea Party has also done right frightening, in that it seems to justify the bullying nullification of any law that an outspoken group dislikes, whether it is slavery, damage to the environment, racial discrimination, legal abortion, court-ordered busing, taxation of any sort, or illegal immigration. The Tea Party opens up Pandora's box. Out comes chaos, but also hope. In this way, it exemplifies an ongoing struggle in America between law and order and democratic protest. Perhaps we should not be too quick to embrace the Boston Tea Party, which many authorities would today classify as an act of terrorism, as a gauzy, harmless tale of American origins. Americans enshrine their traditions of democratic protest, but they also profess to respect law and order, and our regard for the Boston Tea Party stands at the frontier of these two values. The Boston Tea Party remains an important historical event, not just because it brought about dramatic change in its time, but because it still resonates today. Chapter 1. The Empire's Corporation. Great Britain should not only assert but also support that supremacy which she claims over the members of the Empire, or she will soon only be supreme in words. Thomas Gage, April 13, 1772. In May 1750, the Boston Town Meeting expressed concern that a provincial tax on tea and coffee would bring on the displeasure of those two great and powerful corporations, the East India and Turkey companies in our mother country. 23 years later, as ships bearing tea made their way to Boston, the same town meeting fumed that the East India Company had launched a violent attack upon the liberties of America. Although Bostonians had previously admired the East India Company from a distance and enjoyed its tea, in 1773 they cast the company as a monster, as a danger to the colonists' freedoms. The people of Boston were caught up in the storm and stress of Great Britain's struggle to manage its expanding empire. At the dawn of the 17th century, the Crown of England had created the East India Company, the earliest American colonies, and other global ventures in much the same way. England was then too weak to send its military forces to the far corners of the world, so the Crown had sent chartered companies to do the work of conquest, trade, and settlement. Queen Elizabeth I granted the East India Company, EIC, its charter in 1600 as one of these private ventures, just as King Charles I gave the Massachusetts Bay Company its charter in 1629. In effect, the English government had subcontracted the business of imperialism to adventurers willing to undertake the risk and reap the potential rewards of an overseas voyage. Since its founding, the EIC had been trading, fortifying, making allies, and fighting rivals, literally with guns, in the East Indies and beyond. Queen Elizabeth's charter granted the company a licensed monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. The EIC carried spices, silk, cotton, opium, gold, silver, and tea across enormous distances, paying out generous dividends to its shareholders. In the 17th and 18th centuries, most people assumed that such monopoly grants were beneficial. They would help the company, as an extension of the English national interest, stand up to the country's continental European rivals. The trade bolstered the economy and helped to support the government through payment of customs duties. The company became, along with the Bank of England, part of the backbone of national finance. Of course, there was a downside to monopoly companies. They stifled competition, and a corporation with such enormous power also wielded inordinate leverage over indigenous Indian Ocean traders. Nevertheless, the shareholders enjoyed the company's relative freedom, and the company did its best to take advantage of its trade networks, its financial power, and its government connections. During the 18th century, Robert Clive became the most famous of the company's adventurers in South Asia. Clive was tough, daring, and manic-depressive, and he had amassed a great fortune during his years of energetic service for the company. He earned his fame in Great Britain and wheedled an Irish barony for himself, in part because he had defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. In 1765, Lord Clive was serving as the company's governor and commander-in-chief at Bengal. He arranged for the company to assume the Diwani, or civil administration, over Bengal's 20 million people, convinced that its revenues could yield an annual profit of £1.6 million and more. Over the next few years, the EIC aggressively assumed the authority of an imperial government in Bengal, collecting taxes, building up its military presence, striking new and often obnoxious arrangements with local merchants and artisans, encouraging the development of cash crops, stripping local elites of their power, and increasing its control over the territory. Starry-eyed British optimists were enthusiastic about these developments. The company's new acquisitions, the Gentleman's Magazine speculated, may open to this nation such a mine of wealth as in a few years to enable administration to pay off the national debt, to take off the land tax, and ease the poor of burdensome taxes. The company already paid customs duties that amounted to around a third of the customs revenue for the entire nation. In 1767, the ministry decided to sink its teeth into the Bengal revenues as well. The EIC, hoping to keep these profits for its shareholders, did its best to beat back the ministry's efforts. As a compromise, the company granted what was in effect an annual bribe to Parliament of £400,000, 4% of the Treasury's total revenue, in exchange for keeping government oversight off its back. As the writer for the Gentleman's Magazine had hoped, these new Indian revenues helped Great Britain reduce the land tax on its own subjects at home. The interests of company shareholders and the British state were now closely tied. The British public also began to comprehend the darker side of British involvement in India. The company accumulated a long record of irresponsible greed and corruption in the 1760s. East India Company employees like Robert Clive, Thomas Rumbold, John Caillot, George Piggott, and others returned from their service in India as nabobs and flaunted their newfound riches. They acquired seats in Parliament, baronetcies, Irish peerages, and knighthoods. A newspaper correspondent warned that Parliament needed to consider new regulations in conducting the affairs of the East India Company and of limiting the power of their servants abroad, who have all showed an eagerness to return home early in life with nabob's fortunes, which can only be acquired by embroiling the company in perpetual war. In Bengal, meanwhile, money was growing scarcer, and the population had become more vulnerable to natural cycles of drought and flood. Lest anyone try to fault the company for these difficulties, EIC employees blamed the indigenous rulers of Bengal as untrustworthy, vice-ridden, and despotic. Back in its plush offices on Leadenhall Street in London, the East India Company could do little about their employees' independent trading and often rampant corruption, just two ingredients in a riot of mismanagement that almost tore apart the company in the years 1769 to 73. Suddenly the gods turned angry in Bengal in the fall of 1769. Not a drop of rain fell. The paddy withered in the fields and became like straw. This was how the 19th century novelist Bankim Chandra Chatterjee described the suffering in northeast India in Anandamat, the book of historical fiction that he published in 1882. For most of the 18th century, Bengal was a rich corner of the once powerful Mughal Empire. Farmers coaxed crops from fertile fields, muslin weavers and silk winders unfurled magnificent fabrics that were prized throughout the world. Traders shuttled goods up and down the Ganges River valley. Now, as the ground hardened, the drought choked the life out of half the land's crop. Scarcity soon drove the price of rice to more than 20, in some places 50, times its normal rate. Once again, people went hungry. First, they skipped a meal, then even the one meal they had was reduced by half, and finally they fasted throughout the day. People started to beg. Soon there was no one to give alms, so they started to go hungry. Then they began to succumb to disease. Then they sold their cattle, their plows and cattle yokes, finished off their seed paddy, and sold all their possessions. Then they sold their land. After this, they started selling their girl children, then the boys, and then their wives. Finally, who was there to buy the children and the wives? There were no buyers, since everyone wanted to sell. For lack of food, they began to eat the leaves of trees and grass and weeds. The low caste and those who lived in the forests started to eat dogs, mice, and cats. As corpses piled up in the streets and bazaars of Murshidabad and Calcutta, the scholar Karam Ali wrote, "People could not find the time or inclination even to bury their dead. Jackals, vultures, pigs, and dogs made prey of human carcasses. There were even whispered accounts of far worse. In early reports of this disaster, observers guessed that Bengal lost a third of its population, later estimated to be about 10 million people. Although the death toll was probably closer to 1.2 million, the famine's raping of human life was undeniable. Had it struck the 13 colonies of North America, it would have wiped out half of the entire population. Some regions of Bengal indeed lost about half their people to starvation. Tigers and elephants roamed through deserted settlements as the jungle reclaimed the landscape. Bengal was starting to look like a country sucked dry, not just by the fateful shifts of nature, but by the profit-seeking of traders and tax collectors. "This affliction comes from the hand of your countrymen," said the sufferers who confronted one English witness. The company provided only a few scraps of charitable relief, and it did little to ease its taxation of the region during the famine, as the earlier Muslim Mughal regime had done in times of scarcity. Instead, the company stockpiled grain to feed its own garrisons and kept dunning its new subjects for revenue even as the carnage mounted. As Chatterjee wrote, "People could die of starvation, but the collection of revenue didn't stop." Warren Hastings, the new governor of Bengal in 1772, reported to London in chilling terms that revenue collection had been violently kept up to its former standard. The pocketing of bribes by company employees continued as well, while Parliament and the British press were a 6-month journey away. But news of the calamity and the corruption eventually broke. Horace Walpole, a member of Parliament and the son of a former Prime Minister, wrote, "The oppressions of India, and even of the English settled there, under the rapine and cruelties of the servants of the company, had now reached England, and created general clamor here." The public blamed the Bengal famine on the monopolistic practices of East India Company agents. A tithe, 10th, of these crimes was sufficient to inspire horror. In the coffee houses of London, people began to look upon the riches accumulated by company servants like Lord Clive, the former Bengal governor, and his fellow arriviste nabobs with disgust. William Bolts, himself a former company merchant in Calcutta, pointed to the company's servants who, after exhibiting such scenes of barbarity as can scarcely be paralleled in the history of any country, have returned to England loaded with wealth. William Pitt the Elder, now Lord Chatham, despised these nabobs who had no natural interest in the soil, and called them mere importers of foreign gold engaged in private corruption. Alexander Dow, a former EIC Army officer, spoke of the gloom of Bengal and warned, "The ruin which we have brought on an unfortunate country will recoil upon ourselves." A few whispers about the melancholy news of the Bengal famine eventually found their way to the western reaches of the British Empire, to Boston and New York and Philadelphia. American colonists initially said little about the news, although reports reached them just as they were contemplating their own place in the empire. Still, they must have been shocked by what they read in reprints from London newspapers. One account described an Englishman who had returned from Bengal, having amassed above £100,000 by a monopoly of rice, and to which monopoly, it is said, was chiefly owing the late terrible and affecting famine in that country, by which nearly 100,000 unhappy people lost their lives. Who would wish the enjoyment of riches at such a price? Another item read, "The cruelties exercised upon the innocent natives of Bengal for some years past, and the scene of rapine that has been carried on there by the servants of the company, call aloud to heaven itself for vengeance." By 1773, Americans' mute bemusement would turn to fear that they might be next. Meanwhile, the fate of the company in Great Britain was worsening. Once the British public had awoken to the possibilities for profit in Bengal in the 1760s, increasing investments had turned to frenzied speculation in company stock. Then, when investors heard news in 1769 about a military setback in Madras, now Chennai, the bubble burst. Waves of financial panic and distress reverberated worldwide. A few years later, in the summer of 1772, Alexander Fordyce, a suave, handsome Scottish investor who was later satirized as a macaroni gambler, bet more money than his bank had on East India Company stock. He guessed wrong, and his mistake threw an entire network of heavily leveraged banks into ruin. In Amsterdam, the newspapers called it a British twister and blamed the EIC. Fordyce himself fled to France, but the damage was done. As if connected by an electrical wire, the Scottish writer James Boswell observed, the people in every corner of the country have almost instantaneously received the same shock. The twister of bankruptcies blew throughout England and Scotland. Indeed, as it became harder to secure new loans, the shock of the banking crisis was eventually felt in the West Indies and North America, and across Europe as far as Russia. The inability to borrow money only added to disgruntlement in the North American colonies. The East India Company's stock was sinking, and it threatened to take the British imperial economy down with it. Thomas Pownall, a member of Parliament and former Massachusetts governor, wrote that the Bengal revenues had been wrought into the very frame and composition of our finances. There seemed to be no way of going back. To make matters worse, the East India Company was bleeding its dividends out to shareholders, many of whom were members of Parliament, at rates that had ballooned from 6% in the early 1760s to 12.5%, rather than reinvesting its profits into the company's infrastructure, or reducing its prices, or easing up on revenue collection in Bengal. The Chinese tea trade presented the company's directors with another headache. The EIC depended on monopolizing the trade of this valuable commodity, and the British Treasury stood to gain a great deal from customs revenue. Without competition, or at least without legal competition, the company could charge high prices, which more than covered its shipping expenses and tax obligations. And so the EIC had been steadily ordering more and more tea from China. It was a colossal mistake. British and foreign smugglers were bringing in thousands of pounds of illegally imported tea and offering it to British customers at cut rates. Perhaps the majority of the tea consumed in the British Isles was smuggled from the European mainland, where the Dutch, French, Swedes, and other nations had their own Chinese import companies. With all of this tea business going to illegal competitors, tea began piling up in company warehouses unsold. The amount now stood at over 17.5 million pounds of the leaf, more than everyone in England drank in a year, potentially worth over 2 million pounds but sinking in value. Sir George Colebrook, a banker educated at the University of Leiden, was chairman of the East India Company in 1772, and his company now faced a desperate situation. The EIC was losing more money than it had on hand. Its expenses on military fortifications in India were eating up more and more of the budget. The company had still not worked out the kinks of its revenue collecting in Bengal. Meanwhile, its own agents, nabobs like Clive, were making private fortunes that cut into the company's profits. Its stock was tanking. The banking crisis led to delays in some payments that were due to the company, and those pungent piles of tea filled thousands of crates worth of unrealized profit. Every year, the East India Company turned to the Bank of England for a loan to cover temporary shortfalls until the company could collect its earnings from sales. By summer, the company's debts were mounting, and it was begging the bank for further loans. This time, the bank refused. The EIC also owed the British government over £1 million, £400,000 for the annual payment, and the rest for customs duties. By autumn, the company's total debts were staggering, over £1.3 million. Its only solution was to suspend payment of the annual dividend to shareholders for that year. Now Parliament and the shareholders were paying attention. John Burgoyne, a member of Parliament, who would later lead an army against American troops at Saratoga, headed a parliamentary select committee to address the problem. In May 1773, His committee began inquiring into the offenses that Lord Clive and other company employees had committed in South Asia. The British cabinet under Prime Minister Lord North seized on the climate of negative publicity.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?